Great, so I'll start. Hello, nice to meet everybody. My name is Roee. It's actually my first time being here and presenting in DEF CON, so I'm quite excited. Thank you, thank you. So we have a bit of a technical difficulty so I'll start by presenting the introduction a bit without a screen, and hopefully it will be fixed by the time we'll get to some of the graphs and the results that I want to show. So my name is Roee. I'm a PhD student in Ben Gurion University, and I'm part of the CBG Cyber Ben Gurion Research Lab. Today I'll be showing you a framework that we designed to plan and optimize DDoS targeted attacks on satellite networks. The idea of these attacks is not to use brute force, but to try and see how can we utilize smart and sophisticated and planned traffic in order to congest critical links and causing widespread damage. So our goal in this research was to try and better understand and get a comprehension and an understanding what is the size of the botnet that is required to implement such an attack. Are there any interesting geolocations that we can identify, and how can this attack extend way beyond? So LEO satellite networks are such as Starlink, OneWeb, and Kuiper are already being integrated in plenty of services by connecting people from remote areas, backing up national infrastructure, and providing emergency communication during disaster and war. The problem in these networks is that the links between the satellites are relatively limited in comparison to terrestrial networks, as well as the fact that there is publicly available data that is being published daily about the locations of the satellites. So that means that an attacker using open specs and some simulations, has the ability to understand exactly where each satellite will be and pretty much what they will be connected to in each point of time. And with an accuracy very close to reality, I think it's a degradation of around 2 to 3 kilometers per couple of days of simulation. So DDoS attacks are usually about throwing a lot of targets at the server, but in satellite networks, this is not usually the most optimal case because we have limited bandwidth, and the total number of users is smaller relative to terrestrial networks. So an attacker will most likely try and to create a more sophisticated idea and a more sophisticated attack, and try to find bottlenecks and targeted links that he can utilize to just disrupt the communication with even a modest amount of traffic. So we wanted to find out, can you break communication between regions without needing a massive botnet? And the size is yes. So satellites are already under attack. In the past couple of years, there's been a couple of notable incidents. For example, in 2022, there was an attack on the Viasat network through the satellite network, satellite constellation, where the attackers used misconfigured VPN to wipe out thousands of modems, even affecting wind farms in Germany, making them lose connection. Another notable attack was as well in 2022, where a attacking group called Killnet, a pro-Russian hacking group called Killnet, claimed responsibility for a DDoS attack on a satellite network. So the amount of attacks keeps growing more and more throughout the years lately, and these attacks are no longer just theoretical, they are already disrupting real net infrastructure. As they become more frequent and more common, there's a better need to understand them to put better mitigations and defenses in place. So while I'll talk about today, I hopefully will get a presentation. I will be able to show you the graphs as well, but I'll talk about what makes satellite networks unique, how they work, and we'll talk about what are link flooding attacks. I'll present to you our framework called HYDRA, which is 4 different strategies that we planned in order to try and better understand these attacks. And then we'll discuss about preliminary defense methods. So let's do a quick recap. LEO satellites are satellites that orbit around Earth at around up to 2,000 kilometers. They communicate with the ground using a ground satellite link, or GSL for short, and they communicate between each other with ISL, inter-satellite links. They are usually using or laser-based optical or radio frequency communication. LEO satellites move relatively fast compared to the Earth. They complete a lap around the Earth every 90 minutes. And when you have thousands of satellites in the satellite networks and they are moving so fast constantly, the network is changing constantly. Links form and break and paths are rerouted constantly. So we wanted to understand and think what types of attack are most likely going to occur in satellite networks. And the best place to understand it is to look at simply what is going on in terrestrial networks today. One of the most common attacks is the denial of service. And there are plenty of different types of attack, as you're probably aware, of denial of service, including a volumetric DDoS attack, a protocol-based attack, and application layer attack. And each one is exploiting a different part of the network stack. So one of these attacks is the link flooding attack, or LFA for short. The idea of this attack is not to attack just the server, but to focus on the infrastructure itself. The goal of the attack is to focus on congesting specific links in the network, causing congestions and disruptions for all the users that use these links as paths. The interesting thing about this type of attack is that most defenses are focusing on endpoints, making them often harder to detect. And when you're talking about a system that is dynamic and changes and links form and break constantly, it's even more dangerous. So link flooding attacks aren't new. They've been around for over a decade. There's been research that's been done about it. The first attack was done in Cormelt, where they showed that they can traffic. It's supposed to be a graph where you see two servers. I will convey it to you. It's the best way I can. Two servers, and there's a link that is connecting between them. And the point is that an attacker just has to pass traffic through a specific link. By congesting this link, he can disrupt the communication. Later on, Crossfire expanded on it by showing that you can utilize nominal traffic to do it and to send it to public server. And by planning it optimally, it looks like nominal traffic. So when you look at it like network-wise, it looks like everything is normal. But your targeted areas become disrupted and the communication becomes delayed. So the question arises, what makes satellite networks even more vulnerable to these types of attack? One, as I mentioned beforehand, everything is predictable. We know all the satellites' location, we can predict where they will be, and we can estimate which because satellite links and ISLs and GSLs are known, the capacity and how they're laid out usually, we can estimate which ones are connected to each other. In addition, the links themselves are usually limited in capacity. We're talking about a few tens to just a few hundred gigabits per second in their link capacity. And because they tend to favor low latency routes, we can get a good estimation of what the routes will be. And usually from assessments that's been done, they're pretty accurate in the paths that are being taken. In addition, a botnet that can be used is global. That means that I can inject traffic into the network from pretty much any botnet that has access to the internet, to the network itself. So putting this all together, we get a perfect condition to create a stealthy global link flooding campaign on the satellite networks. So in current deployments, most satellite traffic aims to reach the ground stations as quickly as possible in order to relay the rest of the path through the terrestrial network. But this behavior is likely to change in the near future due to the fact that prior research and work has shown that direct communication just going straight through the satellite can reduce latency by more than 2 times compared to terrestrial network. This is simply due to the fact that satellite paths can be more direct because we can pretty much, it's pretty global, and light travels faster in vacuum than in comparison to fiber. And this can be very beneficial for communications, for long-haul communications, areas when there's less ground station coverage, and scenarios where latency and sovereignty matters. In this talk, I'll be focusing more on the latter because there's more links there that we try to understand, and in the first scenario is a bit more simpler to attack. So what is the core idea behind the attack? Again, I'll present it, I'll talk about it. The idea is, can we upload link that passes through the network of the satellite networks to target congested links that will disrupt the communication between two different geographical zones. That means, for example, if I want to disrupt communication between New York and LA, I will just need to target a few sets of links that I know will most likely all the traffic will need to pass through them, and thereby creating a disruption and a delay. So the goal in mind is to use it's not that simple when you think about it, because as I mentioned before, we have thousands of satellites here. They're constantly moving, they're constantly changing. We need to be precise, because if we don't congest all the links, then the attack won't work. And if we use too many botnets, then it will become very clear, because we'll congest much more than what we anticipate and want. So past work has already began to work on this topic. Icarus was the first one to implement this. They showed how we can inject traffic into a network and to congest key satellite links, and show that it can be done even when there is different routing protocols. Later works expanding on this, exploring short time-based attacks and showing how you can study and understand the orbital patterns of the satellite networks to focus on targeted links to cause very widespread disruptions and causing a lot of harm in the network. In addition, by analyzing these shifts and the traffic that it goes, additional research was able to show how you can estimate and predict good bottlenecks in the network. But there are some questions that still remain open. The question is, what is the actual size of the botnet that I need to use? Can I just use 10? Do I need a couple of thousands, a million? What's the numbers? What's the actual traffic that I need to use in order to actually implement the attack? What's the number of botnets? How do I sustain this attack, not over a short period of time of just a couple of minutes, but I want to try and make it persistent over a long period of time, for an hour, a lap or two, and even more. And what happens when I try to target more simultaneous zones, like when I try to target multiple zones, and what can I learn from them? So this is where we start to assess the stuff, and we can begin by trying to understand that this is an optimization problem that we're trying to solve in the end. The goal of this is to try and simulate everything in order to get a better understanding of the problem. So we presented the problem as an optimization problem, and we modeled the system as a satellite network, the satellite network as a graph over time. We presented the time as snapshots with varying time intervals, and the graph was presented by nodes, which represented the users on the ground and the satellites, and the links presented the GSLs, which is the ground to satellite links, and the ISLs, which are the communication between the satellites. Because satellites are moving constantly and there's constant change, the network is constantly changing and is constantly evolving. That means that each snapshot, there's different links, there's different communication, and there's different routes. When we're looking at two different zones, we can extract all the possible paths that data will convey between them. And our goal is to create a congestion in each one of these paths. So what are the attacker's capabilities in such a scenario? They're actually quite simple. We presume that he has a botnet, or we're trying to assess a global scenario and try to evaluate what is the size of the botnet that is required. The attacker can have a coordination of sending the traffic and injecting the traffic into the network, and that he has publicly available data of the TLEs of the satellites, and thereby being able to predict where the satellite's location will be. We considered a link to be congested where the total traffic in the network that exceeds the link's capacity. So it's pretty simple. And we consider a path is congested if there's at least one link in the path of the two zones that is congested. And with this, we can define a minimization problem where our goal is to minimize the size of the botnet while keeping all the zones congested. So we first started to look on what is the minimal size for a single snapshot, just to get a baseline understanding. The goal in mind is to understand what numbers are we talking about. So of course it differs from different satellite networks, bandwidth and capacities. So for this simple case study scenario, I will talk about the first shell of the Starlink link. This will be the best way to convey it. So from our initial analysis, we were able to show that with just around 1,000 bots, we were able to create these congestions and to create zone disruptions. So it was around 50% more efficient than previous methods that were done. But this gives us a baseline that even this is of course a simulation and a best case scenario, but we're talking about just a few thousand bots to create targeted congestion in a network, which is quite small. We later on expanded this attack to look on a continuous attack. We wanted, in the end of the day, not to just look of, okay, the attack just happens in a single snapshot of time, but it should be able to continue and develop and expanding according to how the network changes. So in order to do that, we did the optimization problem not just on a single snapshot, but across multiple snapshots simultaneously, while trying to remain with the smallest botnet possible. The goal in mind here is to find a botnet that can find the most critical bots in the best geographical location in order to congest continuously the links over time. And the results that we saw are that in regards to the increase in the botnet size, you just need around 10 to 15% in comparison to the single snapshot in the botnet size. So we're still talking about just a few thousand bots, around 1,000 to 1,500 bots in order to make this attack continuous. So, and in the way we evaluate this is we took a 90-minute interval, which is a single orbit around the Earth for the satellites, and we split it into 30 seconds intervals. And we looked and we tried to optimize with different snapshots in mind. And what we saw is, of course, the more snapshots I was able to use, the better the attack has been, the accuracy has improved. I was able to succeed and maintain it longer. But we wanted to see what happens when we look forward to trying to keep the attack even more consistent over a longer period of time. So we ran the attack over 90 more hours and to see how this attack maintains over a long period of time where it wasn't even optimized or studied or tried to assess. And we were able to see that this attack remained pretty consistent. There was a drop of around 1 to 2%, but it remained pretty stable, so it wasn't just a degradation over time thing. And it shows that we don't need a big botnet in order to create this attack. One of the interesting attacks that we continued on was to try and see, can we create a flexible botnet that can be used across multiple scenarios? The idea in mind was to try and understand, can we create a botnet that is versatile, that can attack pretty much any zone pair in the world? That means that it will have the flexibility and the understanding as well. Where are the bots with the most the geographical location of the bots with the highest impact that can be utilized with a lot of place, which can give a defender an advantage where he's trying to understand where should I focus my mitigations, where should I focus my resources on more. And we were able, okay, this part is a graph, so I'll try to do it like this. It's a logarithmic graph that shows that the amount of traffic that was done when we optimized this method was a logarithmic growth. The reason why it's a logarithmic growth is because the attack was able to find bots and locations that were able to be persistent and flexible across multiple zone pairs and options. And we wanted to evaluate, as I said, how is the effect of this global, how can they be globally? And what we saw is that even if we optimize, for example, for 48 different zone pairs, And we tried to evaluate it on thousands of different zone pairs that we did not train and we did not optimize on. We were able to persistently attack with just around 6,000 bots, over 85% of the zone pairs in the network, which was just globally generated from with a GDP probability in mind. We created a heat map which shows where are the locations of the most common areas for different attacks. The goal in mind was to think, I don't want to just assess a single for multiple pairs, but I'll look on a couple of zone pairs that have interest. We focused here on the communication between the US, Europe, and Europe, Asia, and Asia, US. And we were able to create a heat map. And what is interesting in the heat map that we had two huge hotspots in the area of around, you can say, New York and that area, and the area around China and India, which were the areas that were most probable. So well, it's a very interesting to see it, and it has the potential to, we can understand with that in different attack scenarios, where are the most likely botnets will be. The next attack that we did was a simultaneous multi-zone attack. And this is the most aggressive attack that we looked on, which is the goal is to try and to congest as much links as possible between the zones, as much pairs as possible to congest them in order to create as much disruptions as possible. The approach was to try and find what are the critical links. If there's in time critical links that can actually disrupt a couple of communication zones. And we see here as well, there was a linear growth, a logarithmic growth, excuse me, in the amount of this botnet size in comparison to the amount of zone pairs that we attack. For example, for around 30 zone pairs, we just needed around 10,000 bots in order to congest all the zones between them. And we were able to also see that when we were trying to think where the attacker might attack, we were able to understand and detect where are the critical links that they are more likely to focus on. So to recap, we looked at 4 different methods to try and understand, and from those we understood that these attacks can be relatively small with just a few thousands. It can be continuous and persistent over a long period of time. It can be very flexible, and it can be very simultaneous, which is pretty dangerous, honestly, when more and more infrastructure and people rely on these networks. So we started to look on some mitigation methods and preliminary ideas that we had. Our first idea we looked on was adaptive routing, where instead of using a probabilistic or stuff like that, we wanted to see when the paths change constantly in accordance to the dynamics of the network, how much the links are congested and stuff like that. And we saw there was indeed a decrease in the success of the attack, but still, if an attack was persistent and used just a bit of a smaller botnet, he was still able to execute the attack by congesting also the fallback options. However, it did increase the attack, but it does come a bit with the cost of adding a longer latency and a longer amount of jumps between the satellites. Another approach that we looked on was a link throttling, a targeted link throttling, where we limited the amount of the user's traffic that used the links that were congested. And we saw, we evaluated on different amount of limiting, of bandwidth limiting, and we saw that when we were going for the extreme, we were able to actually mitigate quite a lot of the attacks. Over 80% of the attacks when we were looking at where we limited the users to just 1 megabit per second. Of course, this is not feasible in a network when you have users that you want them to have proper communication. But it does give the idea that by combining a couple of mitigation methods together and utilizing a smart detection, we can be able to make the attacks increase in the cost and become more difficult to actually implement. So in short, HYDRA shows that the attack doesn't need a massive botnet to overwhelm traffic or to cause serious disruption in a satellite networks. What makes this especially concerning is that it doesn't require any special technique or any smart ideas, just a good understanding of the network and a small size of a botnet. So I'm sorry about the fact that we didn't have a presentation. So if someone wants to see the notes and see the graphs, I'll be more than happy to show them to you after. Feel free to come and ask. And thank you for listening. you.